So I have 11:15, and one of the parts of this tradition is we actually start on time, because Humanities does that. So let me welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Olfer. I'm the chair of the history department, and I heard it. I already gave you a break. And it's my great pleasure to open this event every year. Our students in the humanities are incredible. They're very, very talented people, and we're so lucky to get to work with them. So let me, on behalf of all the humanities departments, let me welcome everyone to this extraordinary event. We're going to hear from great scholars today. I am going to ask you to do something very difficult, and I know this is hard. Turn off your phones. I know it's hard because I forget to do it all the time. I won't make fun of it. Other professors in the class who sometimes forget to do it as well. I don't remember. How are you? But please do turn off your phones because it is awfully distracting when they go off in the middle of the presentation. We have two panels today. We're going to start the first one in just a minute. The first is on politics and government, and then the second is on women, power, and poetry. That will start around 12:20. The other part of this tradition that we've begun in humanities is we always ask the administrators to open this event. And we're very lucky this year that Dr. Susan Burns was kind enough to join us. So I'm going to ask Dr. Burns to please come down.
It is truly my pleasure to be here with you today, students. Good luck. Congratulations. This is exciting for us to hear the significant work you put into this project and the presentations today. In preparation, I just want to take just a brief moment. In preparation for my opening of this event, I wanted to re-find an article that I found a couple years back that talks about the undergraduate student experience and how that prepares people for life. And there are characteristics of the undergraduate experience that researchers have found significantly predict life preparedness and happiness. And they measure that by looking at experiences with work, success at work, and overall well-being. And I think students, you can rest assured we're doing that for you. And today is a good example of how we do that for you here at the Mount. So they call these the Big Six, the items of the undergraduate experience that prepare you for life and well-being. First of all, it's about support in the first category. I had at least one professor at college who made me excited about learning. You don't need to raise your hands, make mental note. That's something that we work very hard to do here at the Mount. And congratulations, students, you have people who want to make that possible for you. The second is my professors at the college cared about me as a person. I've not seen a place that does that more than the College of Mount St. Vincent. I had a mentor who encouraged me to pursue my goals and dreams. Guess what, students? That's part of caring for you as a person, and my guess is you can check that one on the list as well. The other categories in broadly experiential. I worked on a project that took a semester or more to complete. Undergraduate research of all kinds takes a significant amount of investment, and so congratulations again on that effort, and look forward to preparing you for life with that. I had an internship or job that allowed me to apply what I was learning in the classroom. We want the experience to be an important part, and you can have that at the Mount as well. And lastly, this one's outside of the classroom, but also predicts life preparedness. I was extremely active in extracurricular activities and organizations while I attended college. I know our students well and how involved they are. And so if you were checking off those different things, know that we have prepared you well for life. You have prepared yourself well for life, and so I congratulate you on that. I so look forward to the presentations that are here today. Again, good luck, welcome. Thank you all for being here and being a part of this important event for the Mount. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burns. Okay, and now I'm going to do something I always look forward to at this event, which is I'm going to sit down and stay quiet and turn things over to Dr. Joshua Twigler, who's going to share our first panel.
Thanks. I'm going to keep this very short, but just one thing about humanities culture. If you don't ask any questions at the end of this, and everyone sits there silently, you've not given these speakers a compliment. So hopefully we're going to give each of them a chance to present for about 12 minutes, and I'll give you like a 1-minute sign if you're running out of time. And then at the end of it, we'll open up questions for all the panelists, and you can just let us know if it's from one or more people. And also, congratulations to all three of you. I'm really excited to hear about what you've done. So first speaker, Gabriela Lopez, talking about healthcare differences between immigrants, comparing Italy and the United States.
Thank you. Hello and good morning. My name is Gabriela Lopez. And the name of my research project is healthcare differences between immigrants, comparing Italy and the United States. So I did this research with Dr. Liano, and I did it all in Italian. I researched in Italian, did a 30-page paper in Italian, and now I translated everything to English so I can present to you guys. And the reason I chose this topic was for my dual interest in psychology and Italian. I also love learning about the difficulties that immigrants face when going to a different country and possibly raising awareness to help them out. Many Italians immigrated to the United States between the years of 1861 and 1914. About 4,051,859 Italians left Italy to immigrate to the United States to have a better life and live the American dream. Many of these people were unskilled and illiterate. These unskilled laborers often worked in textile factories and on the building trades. These people were often taken advantage of by dangerous working conditions, working a lot of hours with low salaries. They also faced much discrimination in the United States and were often referred to as criminals because of the mafia or because of their political activities. Since most of these people who immigrated to the United States were from the South, they were not considered white, so this led to additional ethnic discrimination and stereotyping. They also experienced a huge cultural and language barriers that they had to overcome and learn to live with in a new society. However, Italians are no longer immigrating out of Italy today, but Italy is experiencing a large group of migration entering the country that they're having to deal with today. Italians' immigration population is growing. Like the United States, people from all over the world are entering Italy. Today, there are approximately 4.5 million immigrants living in Italy. Many of them come from Eastern Europe, North and South, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The immigrant migration in Italy began in the 1970s. However, in 2008 and 2018, more than about 1 million people from Romania arrived in Italy. People from countries such as Albania, Senegal, China, Nigeria, Ecuador, and from many other countries are going to Italy to live a better life. Many people from Africa cross the Mediterranean Sea by boat, and this journey is very dangerous because a lot of the times their boat gets stranded at sea and many people don't make it out alive. And like in the United States, many of these immigrants face discrimination because of their skin color, their language, and their culture. Healthcare in Italy is very different in the United States. Healthcare in Italy is actually free. So everyone has access to healthcare, including immigrants. This Article 32 was created in 1978, and it granted free healthcare for all people in Italy. But in 1998, free healthcare was granted to undocumented immigrants as well. So some of the benefits include primary health, primary care, hospital visits, and health screenings. So according to Lucetta, who wrote about unmet medical care needs for immigrants in Italy, states, with universal health system coverage such as Italy, the access to care of immigrants can be hampered by a number of social and cultural barriers. Barriers include language, stigma, suspiciousness towards healthcare and healthcare professionals, and poor knowledge of the available resources. Many immigrants in Italy today face discrimination, and Italian immigrants face that many times immigrants faced years ago when arriving to the United States. Even though Italy has free healthcare, there are still disparities within the system. These disparities can be due to language barriers, lack of knowledge about the rights and benefits they have as immigrants. Another reason is that they're skeptical about the system, since some immigrants are undocumented and can face deportation. Many of them don't want to risk that, so. So, according to Lucetta, states, the lack of knowledge about national laws and administrative regulations may limit immigrants' ability to access healthcare, health services, while language difficulties and cultural factors may also represent serious barriers to access. Many immigrants are unaware of the benefits they have as immigrants. Most immigrants in Italy do not speak Italian, and since many come as they get older, it's very difficult for them to learn a new language. So much of the information given out is in Italian, which prevents immigrants from knowing and understanding this information. Italian hospitals and doctors don't have many translators to help them. So this prevents immigrants from understanding what the doctors are saying. And another reason why a lot of immigrants don't use the system is because they need to speak Italian to make appointments. So if they don't speak Italian, they can't make these appointments to go to doctors and stuff. Even if they are aware of their benefits, not knowing the language does prevent them from using all these benefits that Italy has for them. The author who said that again states in an article, the intensity of mental health care provision in terms of the number of interventions and days of hospital and residential care is lower for immigrants. Mental health is not something that immigrants really talk about or look after because they're all mostly worried about working and taking care of their families back home. But when immigrants do ask for help, the intensity of care they receive is much lower than Italian citizens. They don't receive the same quality of care as citizens, and sometimes the type of quality of care is outdated. Immigrants have much lower intervention days at the hospitals or other facilities they go to. And many immigrants don't also ask for help, but when they do, the treatment is not the same as Italian citizens would get. Immigrants are more likely to be exploited for their work. They work much longer hours in much dangerous conditions, and since most don't have college degrees or high school degrees, they can't find a white-collar job. And they also work for much lower salaries. And because of these dangerous conditions, many people can develop serious illnesses, or they can also just get hurt overall. And sadly, many immigrants do not get the proper care when they are hurt, which leads them to, develop a lot of serious illness in the future when they get older. And all of these can be prevented by just having a better healthcare system that allows immigrants to use this as they have it already. Many immigrants are not hospitalized, even with severe conditions like any Italian citizen would. And even though healthcare is free in Italy, the quality of care is not the same as within the immigrant community. And according to Lucetta again, immigrants with a regular resident permit are more likely to experience unmet need for medical care then Italian citizens and immigrants in an irregular situation are even more likely to experience unmet needs than Italian citizens. Many people wouldn't think that there are differences in how documented immigrants are treated and undocumented immigrants are treated because both groups are immigrants. However, there is a disparities in the healthcare system within the immigrant communities. Undocumented immigrants are more likely to experience unmet needs for medical care than documented immigrants. Some reasons why this would happen is because undocumented immigrants are more likely to be skeptical of the system since they don't have any documents to save them from deportation. They're less likely to go to these, even have faith in the healthcare system or in their doctors. They also are less likely to know Italian or have education to understand how the healthcare system works and how deportation works. They might also just be more likely to be discriminated against because they just don't have documents like any citizen would. And to conclude this presentation, immigrants today and immigrants from the past have faced similar and many of the same obstacles and barriers. However, not much has changed because immigrants today are still facing discrimination and they still don't have the same rights as a citizen does. And even with these benefits that are in place, a lot of immigrants don't use them because of these language barriers or because of they just don't know that people just don't tell them or aren't aware, they just don't raise awareness of the situation. So even though healthcare is free, it's still not equal for everyone. And thank you.
Okay. Next up is Renania Hagen, Remembering the Manon Generation, American Attitudes Towards Filipino Immigrants, 1910 to 1940.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Renania Hagen, and the topic I'm discussing for this year's Humanities Symposium is Filipino immigration in the early decades of the 1900s. I selected this topic because as a Filipino immigrant myself, doing this research honors the lives that paved the way for future Filipinos like me in the United States and the ones that were lost along the way. My research is split into two different parts, the first of which discusses how the attitudes of white Americans towards Filipino immigrants changed, and the second of which discusses the factors that led to this change in attitude. So my first research question is, how did the attitudes towards Filipino immigrants from a white American perspective evolve from the start of World War I to the start of World War II? And these attitudes towards white Americans towards Filipino immigrants evolved from a neutral mindset to a hostile mindset by this time period. And the first reason why these attitudes changed from a neutral one to a negative one was because Filipinos were not subject to harsh immigration restrictions. When Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1917, Filipinos were considered American nationals, which are people that owe allegiance to or is under the protection of a nation without regard to a more formal status of citizen or subject. The intended purpose of the Immigration Act of 1917 was to restrict Asian immigration through a number of measures, such as imposing literacy tests to prove English language proficiency. Americans further curbed immigration from Asia through the passing of the Immigration Act of 1924, and this act also creates new restrictions, such as an imposed quota on the number of immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere, so like basically Asia, which is 50 people per nationality. The Immigration Act of 1924 also places immigrants into two groups, non-quota immigrants and quota immigrants, but Filipinos were not considered any of those groups because they were American nationals. Despite Filipinos not being affected by both the Immigration Acts of 1917 and the Immigration Acts of 1924, white Americans still have reservations about the growing presence of Filipinos in the United States. However, white Americans did not act on those reservations because Americans themselves benefited from the lack of immigration restriction for Filipinos. Americans saw Filipinos as a cheap and viable labor force, especially at a time where exclusionist policies towards other Asian groups made it difficult for business to be conducted in the global economy. There are also racist implications of being a national, so it's not entirely true that white American attitudes towards Filipino immigrants were positive. Also, white Americans did not take any drastic or violent actions towards the Filipino immigrants during this time period, showing that the reactions were neutral. However, the relationship between white Americans and Filipinos started to change after the passing of the Immigration Act of 1924. The first way that shows how this relationship changed was through the heightened awareness of interracial marriage. There were a number of instances that called for the need to question the race of Filipinos after the passing of the Immigration Act of 1924, but the most important one was the white American reactions to the case Roldan versus Los Angeles County, which ruled on January 1933 that Filipinos were allowed to intermarry because Filipinos and Malays are not considered Mongolians, and Mongolians were not allowed to intermarry in California since the late 1800s. What was interesting was not the ruling itself, but the reactions to this ruling. Many nativists who were local officials in California refused to acknowledge the Roldan decision and sought to move the case up from the California Court of Appeals to the California State Supreme Court, saying that they will not recognize any Filipino and white marriage until the Supreme Court approves the Roldan decision. On March 27, 1933, the state Supreme Court upheld the lower court's decision by refusing to grant a rehearing of the case. However, this ruling lasted a little over a week since California Senator Herbert C. Jones was able to get 2 bills which successfully voided the Roldan ruling ratified on April 5th of that same year. White lawmakers in California only took a month to write and ratify bills, making interracial marriage illegal for Filipinos, a process that could take many years to do. Given the lack of dissent from state legislators and the governor in California, it is arguable that all the members of these groups had a negative opinion towards Filipino immigrants. And the most shocking methods white Americans used to ostracize Filipino immigrants was race riots. The anti-Filipino riot that is most known is the Watsonville riots. Violence first occurred on January 19, 1930, when white vigilantes attempted to raid the Monterey Bay Filipino Club in Palm Beach, California. This attempt was unsuccessful, but on that same evening, carloads of vigilantes roamed the streets, going on Filipino hunting parties in mob groups of up to 200 to 700 people. Acts of violence, including looting and bombing properties such as Filipino clubs and ranches known to house Filipinos, and vigilantes also mauled Filipinos and even threw them down bridges. The violence reached its peak on January 22, 1930, with the number of people in these mobs reaching up to 700 people. These mobs traveled from the city to surrounding ranches on the San Juan Road, attacking any Filipino they saw. They approached the John Murphy Ranch, where a carload of vigilantes shot into a bunker housing Filipino farm workers. 22-year-old farm worker Fermin Tobera was shot in the heart with one of those bullets, resulting in his death. There are additional examples in defense of this first thesis, which I will be glad to reflect on during the question and answer period. So the second part of my research answers what factors contributed to the change in attitudes. And there are several factors that contributed to this change, including the economic, social, and global factors. So first, I'm going to talk about the economic factors because Filipino labor played a large role in the rise of anti-Filipino sentiment. And they were seen as the reason why white labor was displaced, causing large resentment from white male workers against the Filipinos that were also, quote-unquote, taking their jobs, especially during the Great Depression. White business owners were able to lower wages when paying Filipinos. For example, in the restaurant industry, they are paid 50 cents to $1 a day less than white workers. A Filipino fry cook would be paid $18 as compared to the usual $40, and a Filipino pantry boy in Stockton would be paid $14 as opposed to the usual $18. Underpaying Filipino workers can also be seen in the agricultural industry. In Washington State, the wages of Filipinos were cut from 60 cents an hour to 25 cents an hour. And because of these lower wages, the competition between whites and Filipinos increased, making the Filipino worker the more desirable worker. And a lot of white labor unions were not happy about that. White Americans in these unions deemed exclusion to be the solution for this problem, and the Washington State Federation of Law said Filipinos would represent cheap and irresponsible labor as they spread such American standards of wages and living conditions. And they feel as if it was not good for labor or American institutions and the standards to permit the free and unrestricted influx of these people. And they endorsed the position of the California State of Labor in asking for their exclusion. A second factor that contributed to the anti-Filipino sentiment is the social standpoint. A lot of white Americans did not like the Filipinos because they mingled with white women. And there was a lack of trust against the Filipinos due to their male presence. Because from the years 1920 to 1929, out of all the Filipinos that arrived to the United States, an average of 90% of those immigrants were men. And 78% of those males were also single. Nativists believed that Filipino men not succumbing to racial inferiority and their status as non-Americans was problematic, and Congressman A.M. Frey in the New York Times, after the Watsonville riots, claimed that the actions of the white rioters against the Filipinos were a result of them being influenced by the bad actions of the Filipino community. And he also claims that he has confidence in law enforcement in controlling the vice dens which are conducted by Filipinos, apparently. And the third factor that accounts for the growth of anti-Filipino sentiment in this time period was the colonization of the Philippines. Filipino migration is a byproduct of U.S. policies towards and in the Philippines. Colonization changed both the mindset of the colonized and the colonizer, and the preconceived inferiority of the Filipinos from white Americans was emphasized when Filipino immigrants started to become ostracized in American society in the 1920s and 1930s. Imperialism influenced how Americans should perceive anyone other than themselves. Carlos Bulasan, a famous Filipino writer, wrote that Western people are brought up to regard Orientals or colored people as inferior. And the United States relationship with the Philippines has always had racist undertones structured by prominent anti-Black and anti-Indigenous thought, who were seen as inferior by white Americans. This is first seen during colonization, when the United States brought Manifest Destiny to Pacific Asia and took possession of the Philippines. Theodore Roosevelt also justifies the abuse of Filipinos during the Filipino-American War by saying that the war was a race war, and the American victory was the triumph of civilization over forces which stand for the black chaos and savagery and barbarism. Of course, the effect of racism towards Filipinos as a result of colonization cannot be limited to those two instances, but it could also be expressed through their perception towards Filipino immigrants. White Americans used the anti-Filipino racism and rhetoric and associations they were taught when actively ostracizing them in the 1920s and 1930s. To conclude, white American attitudes towards Filipino immigrants evolved from a neutral mindset to a negative mindset from the start of World War I to the start of World War II. Several factors also contributed to the changing attitude of white Americans towards Filipino immigrants, such as the economic, social, and global factors. And during the question and answer period, I look forward to any questions you have towards my research. Thank you all for listening to my research, and thank you to all those people that I mentioned over here. And as we all should, let us all remember and honor the unknown generation. Thank you.
Good job. All right, and now Jessica Pickett, presenting Plato's Totalitarian Regime.
Okay. Hello, my name is Jessica Pickett, and my presentation is about the political parallels between Plato's Republic and the totalitarian regime of North Korea. So Plato's Republic is a discourse in which Plato proposes the order of the soul that best promotes justice, and he explains this idea by comparing it to the most just city. So it's intended as a city-soul analogy, but I'm going to be focusing purely on the political aspects of this discourse because they're so explicit that I thought would be worth scrutinizing. So in his portrayal of the most just city, Plato promotes a regime that heavily resembles a totalitarian state for various reasons, including excessive censorship of art and education, the concentration of power among one ruler, and its utilization of myths, flourishing, and eugenics. Each of these factors contributes to the suppression of human rights and a socio-political order that favors the state over citizens, which I believe are inefficient qualities of a society that promotes justice. Therefore, due to these reasons, the ideal city of the Republic should be considered totalitarian. Totalitarianism is a form of government that is characterized by centralized power among one person or small group of people. Individual citizens are heavily monitored and regulated. Any opposition to the government is prohibited, and the interests of the state are put before the welfare of the citizens. Totalitarian regimes threaten human rights because they suppress citizens' right to choose what is best for themselves through informed decisions. The first reason that Plato's ideal city is totalitarian is its heavy use of censorship of art and education. Plato claims that this censorship will prevent corruption in the education of the guardians. Art is integral to a just society because it promotes the human right to freedom of expression and cultural enrichment. Excessive censorship will prevent citizens from this right, and instead they will only be exposed to music that promotes the ideals of the state. This is a totalitarian element that is also utilized in North Korea. The North Korean government heavily censors all forms of media accessible to the public, and the purpose of this is to prevent oppositional values from taking root within society. The noble lie is also utilized in the education of the guardians. It is a myth that claims all citizens were born from the earth and contain a mixture of metals in their skulls. The rulers contain gold, the auxiliaries silver, and the commoners iron and bronze. This mixture ultimately determines their place in society. Plato believes that this lie will persuade citizens to remain in the faction of society that they are most suited to. The noble lie goes against human rights because it is being used as a form of manipulation that restricts citizens' access to the fundamental truth about their origins and prevents them from forming their own ideas about reality. The same method of manipulation is used in North Korea. North Korean citizens are told various myths about Kim Jong-un and the leaders before him. These myths have been integrated into the culture of North Korea, and they may sound irrational to us. But for citizens raised to believe it and barred from access to any alternative understanding of reality, it is legitimate. The reasons for these lies is obvious. It keeps citizens submissive because they believe they are inferior and the rulers are divine. The next reason Plato's city is totalitarian is his excessive regulation of sexual relationships and procreation between men and women. Men and women are to be matched through a rigged lottery in which the best men are paired with the best women and the ordinary men with the ordinary women. This system again promotes lying as the best way to persuade citizens of what is best for them with the ulterior motive of progressing the interests of the state. In addition, Plato's system for reproduction involves the realization of eugenics. The rigged lottery itself is a form of eugenics because the physically and mentally superior are being forced together to produce the best offspring. Regarding children that are deformed, Plato implies that they will be terminated, and the entire system of reproduction greatly undermines human dignity. Eugenics are also utilized in North Korea. According to the British historian Michael Cook, in North Korea Enforcing Eugenics, North Korea pursues racial purity by killing disabled infants and forcing abortion of women who bore children to Chinese men. This racial purity is obviously a goal within Plato's Republic as well. Finally, another reason Plato's political regime is totalitarian is because all legal and intellectual power is concentrated among one individual, the philosopher king. This factor greatly threatens a just society because it poses a danger to the protection of human rights and leaves citizens completely vulnerable in cases of corruption. Austrian-British philosopher Popper, in Plato as an Enemy of the Open Society, states that this ideology is referred to as collectivism, in which the value of a person exists primarily in his contribution to the good of the whole, rather than the whole existing for the good of the individual. This ideology follows true of Plato's political policies, including law and executive power. There are no written laws within the city available to citizens. Instead, the power to decide what is lawful is held exclusively by the philosopher king, and citizens must defer to him for all legal issues. This order suppresses human rights because it limits the legal knowledge and power of citizens, making them entirely vulnerable to potentially corrupt rulers. For one, the ruling class is the source of the noble lie and other deceptions used to manipulate citizens. These consequences are more vivid when compared to the power structure of North Korea. Superior legal authority is held by the current leader of North Korea, Joshua. Since all authority stems from him, he is able to use policy institutions to advance his ideals, such as the advancement of nuclear technology. Since the development of nuclear weapons takes financial precedence, the standard of living for North Korean citizens has been greatly reduced. Thus, human rights are undervalued by the superiority of state interests. In conclusion, within Plato's Republic, he implies that citizens are living the way that is most orderly because they are assigned a life that is most suitable to them. So he assumes that citizens will naturally be happy. However, Plato does not actually take into account the individual happiness of citizens. He focuses solely on the overall happiness of the city. On the individual scale, citizens are being robbed of their ability to think for themselves, to express themselves through art, to choose their partners, to have children, and overall to choose a quality of life that is best for them. If the overall happiness of individuals is being sacrificed for the pursuit of state ideals, I believe that justice itself cannot exist within this society because the use of force and deception will be necessary. Thank you.
Okay, so now we've got some time to have questions, so fire away.
It's really hard to be an immigrant, right? I mean, based on the three, it's really hard. I mean, starting as an immigrant, you know, it's hard. I was just focused on my daughter's presentation here, like, it made me realize the sufferings of the Manong generation and we are enjoying what, you know, they have sacrificed. But even with that, we still have the inequality. We can still feel the inequality even in these days. And like these days, we just view them as the Mexicans now. You know, how the Mexicans are treated now, and the other. And I didn't realize that, you know, Filipinos also went through the same ordeal in the past. So. It's more of an insight, more than a question. You know?
Another one for Renee. So you mentioned the inequalities between Filipinos and white Americans and other people in general in the past. So how is the modern response nowadays from Filipinos different from the responses in the past?
Well, one thing I didn't mention is that in the past, the Filipinos did respond to the inequalities that they were facing. So during the Watsonville riots, before the Watsonville riots happened, they published a pamphlet called The Torch, which were response to all the racist rhetoric that is happening to them in that community. I feel like the response is more modern. The more modern response is more collective towards Asians because of the more Asian and stop anti-Asian hate and stuff like that. So I feel like the way that we change is that the Filipinos are still responding, but more in a more collective sense.
Thank you.
I have a question for Gabby. What solution would you propose to immigration awareness of the laws?
Well, I would say that there should be, a program where immigrants can go to and they can learn about all these benefits they have as, immigrants, like healthcare, like food stamp behavior, stuff like that. And this way, immigrants can learn about their benefits and also like hopefully they can learn Italian, so they'll be able to understand more of what like laws, get a job, and just live a better life overall.
So my question is similar to the previous one. I think that it's so unfortunate that this influx of immigration has happened and there's been no really changes to the society to welcome them. So do you think that, what do you think it will take for these changes to occur? Because in the making of this presentation, you spoke about so much violence that immigrants had to, that happened between immigrants and, native citizens. Do you think that that same level of violence will have to occur in Italy for the immigrants to be able to obtain the same rights as citizens, or do you think that there's a more passive solution to it?
Well, I hope there's not much violence, but I think there will have to be some because even the Italian immigrants who migrated to the United States, they also had to conduct violent situations. Like for example, there was this one time where I think it was in Chicago where women were working in factories, and these factories they didn't have like any windows or like proper things for them to get out in case of a fire. So there was a fire in that building, and unfortunately a lot of women did die. And after that, there was a lot of Italians decided that it was it was over, that they had to get some rights and stuff, and they did fight for their rights, and they did get their rights. Now they're more considered to be white and part of society. So I think that something like that would have to happen for immigrants to get their rights.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate that immigrants really have to reach a breaking point for these rights to become available to them.
I don't know, but I would like to ask Jessica a question.
Yes.
All right. What do you mean play with it? The idea that North Korea is this kind of atomic city of past and not being a play with it. I buy it entirely, but what do you think his reaction would be being told, so here's your state, North Korea?
Well, obviously he would disagree, because within the Republic nothing goes wrong within Colopolis, the most just city. And he doesn't believe that lies and deceptions are necessarily wrong. He doesn't believe them as something that deprives people of their rights. And he doesn't believe that the use of violence will necessarily be necessary, unless, I guess, in extreme cases of opposition. Ultimately, he believes that all of this is for the benefit of the citizens, that in order for citizens to be happy, you have to have this orderly structure that may be oppressive, but it keeps everyone where they're supposed to be. And to compare it to North Korea, he probably wouldn't agree that it's the same, because North Korea is renowned for using torture and violence and things like that. And he wouldn't say that that would be present within his city, but his city is conceptual. And I believe that if his city was put into practice, it would definitely resemble North Korea. Hopefully that answers your question.
This one's for Jessica as well. Just bouncing off that question, you did say that Plato's regime uses eugenics, and from what I remember, in our class, they do kill off the children that they believe that are not fit for that type of society, or they believe they're not fit to be guardians. So how does that kind of violence differ from the violence that's used in North Korea, since they're both, in a sense, murder?
Yeah, I agree. Well, obviously Plato would say that, North Korea would say the same thing. They would both say that racial purity is for the best of the whole. Both of these regimes aren't really thinking about the happiness of the individual. I honestly don't think that there's a difference between the use of violence within the Republic regarding eugenics and North Korea. I see them both as something that is morally wrong. It's something that is not just, something that is murder. But if Plato were to hear that argument, obviously he would say that the way that he's conducting it is just.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations to the panel. Amazing work. I would imagine that you had to condense and summarize your research to present to us. I mean, Gabrielle, you mentioned 30 pages. I can imagine the others are more or less the same ballpark. Is there something that you left out you think we should know that you, I mean, because I'm sure that you did, anything that you think we should know?
Maybe about how the generations of Italians today in the United States. I was researching that there's also some, like, when immigrants were here before, I mentioned that their mental health wasn't, it's not very important to them because all they care about is really about, like working, sending money to their families and maintaining their families back home. That was the same thing for Italians when they immigrated here, but it's also like for generations today, it's also very hard for them to look after their mental health because of how their parents or great-grandparents, to them it wasn't important. So right now, since mental health has become such a big thing right now, a lot of people are looking after themselves, like going to therapists and talking about how they feel and stuff like that. For immigrants today, their generations today have to be dealing with that right now, and it is very difficult for them to go get help. And because of how their grandparents were like raised them, thinking like, no, like that's not okay, like you should just focus on like working, becoming successful and stuff like that. So that's what they're dealing with right now. Italian Americans are dealing with right now, with trying to go get help and dealing with all the trauma that happened throughout their lifetime. So I thought that was really interesting that today it's they're still working with that. It's still the same as it was back then.
Something that I left out that I think could relate to the other two presentations is Plato's belief regarding outsiders. In Philopolis, he kind of destroys the structure of the family because he claims that he wants to remove the preference that people have for, their own children or their husbands or wives or whatever. So he completely destroys that structure. However, he explicitly states within the Republic that during war, Greeks would be treated better than outsiders, non-Greeks, or you would call them barbarians. And I think that kind of relates to the other two presentations because it shows that even though he's trying to eliminate preferences, he still has a preference for his own kind, Greeks. And even though the city is promoting justice and fairness and happiness, he's treating outsiders unjustly. And I think I see that in a lot of countries today as well, not just North Korea, but America regarding immigrants, Italy regarding immigrants, and so many other countries that promote these values of accepting people and justice and happiness and fairness. And then when outsiders migrate to their countries, they're not treated the same. So I think that's like a hypocrisy within these countries that claim to promote justice, but then treat immigrants and outsiders unfairly.
So for my paper, this paper is actually my honors thesis, so it's a very long paper. It's about 60 or so pages at the moment. But I feel like I left out a lot of the examples because I condensed this paper a lot for this presentation, but I used a lot of examples that really showed how being Filipino was the problem. So there was a lot, so they really, a lot of the issues that happened, a lot of the racial attacks, there was about 23 attacks against Filipinos from 1927 to 1934. 20 out of 23 of those attacks happened in the West Coast, and 19 out of 23 attacks were perpetrated by white people. So it's just like, it really goes to show that while I didn't condense my paper, there's still a lot of white Americans really took advantage of the fact that these people were Filipino and they turned that into like a social issue. They turned that into an economic issue. They turned that into a global issue. So there's like a lot more instances like about racial marriage, like interracial marriage that I cite in my paper, and certain laws and how much work like these legislators put into making like into ostracizing Filipinos, excluding Filipinos in any roots of public life, whether it be like work or like marriage, because they found them to be a problem, especially since they were the only Asian group that was technically allowed to come in after the Immigration Act of 1924. Because the Immigration Act of 1924 stopped like a lot of Asian groups, a lot of immigrant groups, not just Asian groups like Mexicans and like Puerto Ricans, they were not allowed to come in. They wanted to limit that. But Filipinos, since they were still colonized and since they were still nationals, they were allowed to come in. And because of that, they turned the fact that these people were Filipino into a major problem.
Thank you.
I have a question for Gabriella. I was wondering if, since you mentioned that we have free healthcare and, people like immigrants and stuff like that want to take advantage of that, but there's obviously limitations like barriers and whatnot. Do you think in some cases it would be better off for those immigrants to immigrate or to stay in their home country where they might have access to that? It'd probably be more expensive, but what's your take on that?
Well, this is kind of personal because I am actually an immigrant myself. My parents came here to be for their life. And so I believe that, sometimes going to a different country to get a better life is better because there are different things that we don't know about, like the situation back home, like poverty, like even like criminals and stuff like that, they'll be in their towns and stuff. So I just think that even though they don't get treated fairly, even though they have to go through all these difficulties, I do believe that sometimes, immigrating to a different country is better because you just get a better life, your children will have a better life, and yes, it's really hard, but I just think that at the end of the day, bettering your family is a little bit more important than even just getting healthcare, and even while you're there, you can still educate yourself, you can learn the new language, you can do all these things to, better your understanding of the laws, healthcare and all this stuff, so while also having a better life. So I do think that sometimes immigrating to a different country is definitely the best solution.
Thank you.
This question is for each of you. A lot of us presented us kind of with the darkness of humanity or the challenges of humanity. When doing your research, were there any pieces of hope that you found or pieces that could present optimism for changing that darkness of humanity?
Well, I do think there's hope, I think that there's people out there, like, in the countries where they do look at all this, what's happening with immigrants and stuff, and they do help them any way they can, by going to the doctors with them and translating for them, or just even promoting this free healthcare in Italy, and just teaching the immigrants all this, like the rights and benefits, and just help them out. I think that's such a wonderful thing that people do, and I think that if they continue to do this, it would just create a better, world, and it would help so many immigrants out, even though it's the smallest things they could do. But I do think that there is hope, and I do think that by doing this, translating, helping them out, and just, doing this, will just create a better world.
So for me, like when I was doing my research, one instance that I found was that the same newspaper, the Watsonville Kanjuri, I can't pronounce that, I'm so sorry. That same newspaper that ostracized Filipinos, that published that horrible Filipino rhetoric in Watsonville, they actually wrote an article that apologized for the actions of those white rioters during the Watsonville riots. I know it's not like enough to like really
reflect on the lives that were lost and the people that were just like violently, attacked in these riots, but the fact that these people are gaining some sort of consciousness and realizing that their actions were wrong and that their actions were racist and are still working on some writing an apology towards it, it really shows like the kind of world that we're living in and how it's changing since the 1930s. And another thing is just, I noticed that a lot of people are becoming more aware of these instances, like Filipinos, a lot of Filipino Americans my age, we were raised with I wrote this in my, I read this line, that colonization changed the mind of the colonized and the colonizer. So a lot of the colonized, a lot of Filipinos sort of viewed America as like, a land of opportunity, a place that does no wrong, basically. But there has been a lot of awareness in the youth of Filipino Americans that have realized that this is not the case and that we should take charge of our own history and our own stories. So it's just a lot more awareness, and the fact that people are like finding out that what has happened in the past does not account for what will happen in the future.
I think for my research, I don't really think that there's the only redeeming quality of Plato's Republic is the fact that it's not real. Because even if it was, citizens, they can't even develop an awareness because they're restricted from all sources of higher education. They can't even learn about how they're being oppressed or anything like that. They're completely powerless. So yeah, the only redeeming quality, in my opinion, is the fact that it's not really meant to be a political structure. It's meant to be a structure of the soul. It's how you develop the most justice within yourself. You order it in a very strict way.
So I guess I have a question. For Renee, so it seems like you're sort of arguing that there's a kind of pivot. Tell me if I'm mischaracterizing the position. Sort of a pivot in attitudes starting around 1924, right? And with interracial marriage being kind of the source of the change in attitudes. I guess two questions that might possibly challenge at least you to reframe this, right? Because I wonder, like, where do these race riots come from, and why do politicians seem to think that passing these kinds of laws, even after it's, you first had the court case that ruled in favor of intermarriage, right? I guess the question is, was it just the case that Filipinos slipped through the cracks of kind of an anti-Asian program that was set up, and that there weren't that many in the United States, and so they just didn't get a lot of attention? Did the numbers of Filipinos change between like 1917 and 1924? Was there a massive amount of immigration? And also did the changing economic circumstances also affect when sort of Filipinos are seen as possibly a real threat to a white American's job? Suddenly then you start mobilizing things like racism and anti-immigrant prejudice and this sort of thing.
So from 1917 to 1920, there were only about 5,000 Filipinos that entered the Philippines. And from 1920 to 1929, that number went up by almost 30,000. So that also contributed to the role that the Immigration Act of 1924 did play, because while other immigrants were just limited to 50, how did 30,000 Filipinos come into the country? So a lot of people did take note of that. And I do feel it was some sort of unlucky strike, because Filipinos were in that situation. And it also kind of sucks already, sorry for the lack of formal wording, but it also kind of sucks that the Americans already viewed Filipinos in a state of inferiority due to like the racism and the globalization of the Philippines. So I do agree that it's sort of like an unlucky strike, because the Filipinos were the only ones that were allowed to come into the United States. And the Great Depression happened, and people took advantage, we're always taking advantage of the Filipinos to make more money for themselves. So it's just like a stack of different circumstances that happened for the Filipinos that caused all of this to happen. But it's just the fact that this is happening, and they view violence and legislation and stopping some sort of like interracial marriage to be the solution, I feel like that really shows like the type of society that they lived in back then.
So that would be just, so I think there's one other use of Plato's Republic you can think of, getting someone to write papers like yours. Never goes out of style. No, but it seems like there's a background assumption that Plato doesn't share, and most humans, until pretty recently, wouldn't share, right? So you seem to be assuming that justice has to include a huge element of individual freedom. And then what is valuable is individual rights and individual expression and individual choices, right? And individual freedom, right? This is not how most humans have thought about what the ultimate goal of people are throughout most of human history, right? I mean, this is a very old work, right? Most humans have thought of success in collective terms, right? As part of a group, as the group that they're part of succeeding, flourishing, doing better. It seems like the background of his assumption is definitely a communal sort of strategy. Now you're right, he eliminates the family, which is one sort of group, to make the state the ultimate kind of collective group. And I think in a lot of ways he sees himself as widening people's circle of concern with other people. Although you noted his Greek preference, that was actually a suggestion that the Greeks be better to each other than they had been in the wars that led. They were more ethnocentric and ready to destroy than the Greek who were in the city next door. It was totally common in Greek society. The suggestion is to move away from that. So I guess, why do you think this idea of individual freedom and individuality is so central to justice? Why shouldn't we think about this as operating on a more collective, group-oriented sort of term, especially in that we depend upon other people. We need other people. We're born into families. We're born into societies. Our success depends upon the success of these things.
Well, I think that you're completely right. When you say that throughout history, humans have favored government. The interests of the state have been put before citizens numerous times, the most often throughout history. And I think this idea of individual happiness and individual flourishing is relatively new, and it's something that we see in societies like America, very democratic in our own, and where we have access to, education and things like that, and we're really able to develop a quality of life that is, that's not pressed on us by the government. That's something that we're able to develop ourselves. And I think that I'm a little bit biased when I say that human rights, human dignity, all of those things are essential to justice, because I grew up in a society. And when I compare it to societies like North Korea, I see that I'm able to pursue things here that I would not be able to pursue in North Korea. Like, I'm able to express myself through art, I'm able to express myself through music, I'm able to pursue higher education. The idea of creating a quality of life for myself that is produced by myself and not pushed on me by the government or anything is extremely valuable to me, because in the end, maybe I don't know everything that is best for myself, but at least I'm given a chance to figure it out. Whereas in Plato's Republic, people are born and they're told that they are ultimately meant to be in this part of society, and they're not even given a chance to explore their different talents. They're told that it's kind of something that the metal in their soul ultimately determines their place in society no matter what. They're not able to explore that for themselves. And I think that this individual flourishing, I think that it's important to justice, because I think it's important for citizens to be informed about the government, and I think it's important for citizens to develop their own ideas about reality, and I think it's important for them to develop this idea of conscience, because it prevents rulers and the government from oppressing them in potential cases where these governments are corrupt. They're able to defend themselves at least through dissent, whereas in Plato's Republic, that's really not an option for them.
All right, well, thank you very much. You did an excellent job.
So thank you all so much. We do have another panel coming up in just a couple of minutes. Thanks again. Well done.
Right, well, is there anything else to drink?
There you go. So I think we'll get started with part two. Another really exciting panel coming up, and I have to admit, even though I'm terrified of poetry, I'm very much looking forward to hearing this. These are extraordinary papers on some really interesting topics. Women, politics, and poetry. I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Stephanie Pietros from the English department. We always say nice things about the English department today. Make fun of them again tomorrow.
I'm wounded.
Because they're extraordinary people who work really hard to do great. But just for the record. I'll turn things over to her and let her introduce this wonderful panel. Thank you, Dr. Pietros, so much.
I think I can introduce. It's good to see you. I'm really excited to be here. I think Dr. Odler can attest that I've been doomed in terms of my attendance at the Humanities Symposium. I often am teaching. Last year I was supposed to moderate a panel, and I had a baby the week before. So, anyways, I'm here. I'm not giving birth, and I'm really excited about it. So,
Seems appropriate to a panel about women in poetry. In any case, I'll introduce each speaker before they speak, and then, oops, just touched something. And we'll save questions and conversation until the end. I'm sure there's going to be lots of interesting connections among these papers. So first is Amber Burnett, who will be speaking on the hidden figures of Scandinavia, heroines in Old Norse society and literature. She's a senior history major, and she worked on this paper for her senior seminar, and I thought it was really interesting that she told me really this has like been a 2-year process, starting in our initial kind of lockdown in spring 2020, where she really came to this idea. So that's the cool thing about research, is it develops and changes over time. So let's turn things over to Amber.
Good afternoon. So, women in Pre-Oceanic Scandinavia were riveting during the first century. Norse society can be seen as quite progressive in the way women were treated. Women had the power to be involved with legal disputes. They were trained as warriors to fight alongside men, and were worshipped as goddesses both in real life and in their literature. My research has been split into multiple parts that reflect women's roles in society and how they were portrayed in literature. While researching women in these historic times, the first argument in my paper arose that women have different roles individually. Though there were those outstanding roles for women during these times, the vast majority of women in Old Norse society performed traditional roles in the private sphere, but a small minority of women performed a limited number of impressive roles in the public sphere. The first traditional role within the private sphere of women in Old Norse society was being anchors of the homestead. This too was considered a role that was undertaken by a vast majority of the women in this society. The private sphere reflects where a woman would typically belong as a caregiver for the household, or for the sake of this research paper, the anchor of the homestead. Anchors were tasked with various responsibilities such as caring for the elderly, the sick, and the children, while creating clothing and blankets through homespun after shearing and cleaning wool. The oldest Hesmera Roomstone that was found in Sweden and is dated back to the year 1050 had remarkable runestone carvings in the shape of a serpent. This runestone is also known to be the Hesmera Roomstone, which can be seen on the screen in Judith Best's book, Women in the Viking Age. The runes translate to, "The good farmer, Wanda, had this raised in memory of his wife Heroines. A better housewife will never come to Hesmera to run the farm. Red Bali carved these runes. She was a good sister to Sigmund." Red Bali, a farmer, placed these runestones on his farm to signify how his wife Aldinus was the greatest anchor of his homestead. A housewife of Old Norse society is someone who is supposed to produce goods from resources that are at her disposal, to be able to bring food to the table and clothes for her husband and children. Without the women, a household would fall. They were the ones who raised the children, tended to the fields, oversaw the accounts of the household. There were many aspects of responsibility that women took as a wife and a mother. They were the anchors of the homestead. Aside from private sphere roles as mothers and wives, a small minority of women were seen in the public sphere, playing the role of being providers of combat support. There is often a debate about whether or not shield maidens existed. Shield maidens were women in Scandinavia who received training, armor, and a weapon to fight on the battlefield alongside the infamous Viking men. Neil Price, the author and historian of Children of Ash and Elm, clearly elucidates the importance of burials and excavation sites as sources of evidence that are performed on these burials. On page 166 of his book, Price illustrates how gravesites of women were filled with objects that were commonly used by them. These included weaving materials, spindles, and any sorts of clothes-making materials. This further shows the roles of women in the private sphere, being at home, tending to the needs of their families, and mending what needed to be mended, especially clothes. Price notes that women also existed on warrior campsites, performing private sphere responsibilities. There was a clear presence of women on battlefield campsites, where they would care for men through mending clothes and textile work. Certain tools were found in these campsite excavations that pointed into the direction of women clearly being a part of warfare. But I argue that they were more than just women who were on the campsite, but rather actually on the battlefield itself. While we are capable of seeing objects of the private sphere follow the deceased into the Garden of Freya or Valhalla, there is another burial that changes the perspective of women in Old Norse society. The Garden of Freya and Valhalla are similar to heaven. The garden was for non-warriors, and Valhalla was a great hall that was stored with ferocious warriors who awaited for judgment day known as Ragnarok. But the topic of burials is crucially important, especially the excavation camp in Berka, Sweden. Scholars such as Charlotte Heldenstein, Anna Kielstrom, Torun Zackerson, and Neil Price published an article in 2017 titled "A Female Viking Warrior Confirmed by Genomics." Through a genome-wide sequencing and an isotope analysis, the bones were in fact female. On the screen is a photograph taken of the grave site. It was a common practice for Norsemen to be buried with objects to bring over to the garden or Valhalla. This burial is quite important because now the bones have been declared female, the burial objects stand out tremendously. She was buried with weapons such as shields and arrows. This had led some to believe that she may have been a high-ranking officer. But with having weapons, it can be inferred and believed that she may have been on the battlefield alongside men, not only leading them, but also fighting. Having specifically arrows in her burial site, she could have been a long-range fighter that specialized in shooting arrows. Due to the innate courage and strength of these women, my second argument was brought to light. The majority of women in Old Norse literature were glorified as heroic figures in the public arena. If there is a debate about women's roles on the battlefield as a historical fact, there can be no debate about their role in the battles in Viking literature. In Norse sagas, shield maidens are closely related to Valkyries, but are of Midgard, the mortal realm of Earth. They are the mortal females who wear armor and fight alongside men on the battlefield. They carry weapons and try to reach Valhalla. Shield maidens and Valkyries are a great depiction of female warriors in Norse culture and literature. According to Johanna Richter in her book, Valkyries, she states, Valkyries are firmly supernatural, though a few have human lovers, but they occupy some of the same zones as shield maidens in a whole spectrum of connected motifs that associate women and violence. Both figures are unmarried women who wear armor and are present in battle. Though shield maidens take part in actual combat with Valkyries ride through the air, hovering over battlefields and controlling which of the warriors on the ground get hit with arrows and spears. Valkyries and shield maidens are both involved with sheer violence. One is mythical and one is of Midgard. Valkyries will go down on the battlefield and they will either move spears and arrows to either miss a warrior or direct it straight through their hearts. They would control the enemy's weapons in the same maneuver of weaving, a skill that we would see in the private sphere. The Servants of Odin were beautiful and lion-hearted figures of Norse culture and literature. They choose who stays alive and who lives another day for battle. Or they bring up a warrior to the halls of Valhalla where they would await for Ragnarok. Valkyries play a primitive role in Old Norse literature, such as Brynhildr, who we can see upon the screen. She makes a number of appearances in sagas and poems. A famous poem she appears in is Short Lay of Sigurd. There are many debates on whether she was a Valkyrie or a shield maiden, because she is said to be the daughter of a mortal, but her behavior and lifestyle that surrounds battle and violence reflects that of a Valkyrie at the side of Odin. The way that women are portrayed in sagas and tales demonstrates very masculine features. These features actually demonstrate how they are the embodiment of the third gender theory. Scholar Kathleen Self defines the third gender theory as how the medieval Scandinavian Valkyrie and shield maiden, overlapping categories of warrior, are the best understood as a third gender, a hybrid of masculine and feminine attributes. To my right, there is a photograph of one of the most famous shield maidens. Her name is Lagertha. She is known to being Ragnar Lothbrok's wife, but she is also known for her bravery and her sheer courage on the battlefield, where she purposefully wears her hair down so she can show her locks as she's fighting side by side men. On On the left-hand side, we have a painting of a shield maiden named Hervor. And through this painting, we can tell how the male warriors actually cared for her. And we can infer how they were most likely seen as equals, felt as equals, really on the battlefield. Valkyries were in charge of bringing fallen warriors to the Hall of Valhalla. They also took care of all the warriors that were there. This is a clear example of the third gender theory at work. They are depicted as serving all of those waiting for Ragnarok and accommodating any needs that they may need. These are the private sphere characteristics that were intertwined with the masculine aspects of being a warrior themselves. They are enacting this private sphere and public sphere behavior, and this is what it is to be the third gender theory according to Kathleen Self. The Viking Age is known for being an era filled with accounts of male warriors who raided Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. While these fascinating, grotesque stories exist of this society, women are typically overlooked. Old Norse women can be seen in both public and private sphere, from society to literature. They were the anchors of the homesteads, mothers, wives, and sometimes warriors. In sagas, women are viewed as Valkyries, shield maidens, and goddesses. Women in the Norse community of Scandinavia are the hidden gem behind the infamous stories that have come out of the Viking Age. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Jacqueline Krupe. Her paper is entitled Two Star-Crossed Lovers, Romeo and Juliet, Portray the Inevitable Chaos in Young Love. She is a junior English major, and this paper was written for Shakespeare last spring.
Good afternoon, everybody. So after reading the play, Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare in high school, I originally felt the play seemed to articulate young love as a passionate love that is temporary and impossible to sustain with the same intensity. However, after reading the play again in my Shakespeare class, I began to wonder about the young lovers and their journey to death. My curiosities led to my topic for the research paper, where I specifically focused on the role of gender and their young age in their suicides. I decided to use a psychoanalysis perspective to focus on gender and their young age, to focus on their relationship and consider the cause of their childhood deaths. In my research, I found that many critics discuss elements of masculinity and femininity in the play. Many researchers focus on Romeo, yet I contend that Juliet, in her young, influential mind, led her to suicide, especially because she had no friends her own age. Critics agree that young relationships are often doomed, due to many factors that include their age, desire to rebel from parents, and the influence of friends. Nick Panagopoulos notes that aspects of the play are denoted with masculine and feminine qualities. Romeo and Juliet both fulfill the ideals of their gender. Romeo as masculine or aggressive with homicidal and suicidal tendencies, and Juliet as feminine, which represents power and intelligence. Romeo is portrayed as lovesick and easily suggestible when he falls in love with Juliet quickly after meeting her and tells her that he can't live without her, despite before meeting her he was in love with Rosalind. On the other hand, Juliet craves the freedom that Romeo provides and escape from the confining life of her parents. Critic Paul Coleman argues how Juliet clings to Romeo for personal independence and an escape from her restrictive parents. However, the same freedom could have been provided by a friend her own age who can encourage her to engage in risky behaviors that do not threaten her life. In the play, Juliet is portrayed in solitude as she does not have many intimate relationships outside of Romeo. The exception is the nurse, who Juliet is extremely close with. But the nurse acts as a maternal figure for Juliet. She cannot offer the same intimacy as a friend her own age. Juliet's mother is not close with her and disregards her daughter's feelings for her own gain, which is seen in her hopes to marry Juliet in Paris. Even though it is natural for a young girl to rebel against her mother's wishes, Juliet doing so through her love interest causes her repression and ultimately death. Here's an excerpt from my research paper. A female relationship would have positive impacts on Romeo and Juliet's relationship because it could have allowed her to maintain her maturity, avoiding regression and feelings of dependency on Romeo. Juliet's only genuine relationship is with the nurse, which poses many issues that prevent the nurse from fulfilling the role of a friend. The nurse is not Juliet's age, but she fulfills more of a maternal role for Juliet and is also limited as a servant for the Capulet family. Despite these limitations, the nurse does truly care about Juliet and wants what is best for her. Before the Capulet party, the nurse encouraged Juliet, "Go girl, seek happy nights to happy days." Act 1, Scene 4. The nurse wants Juliet to be happy and enjoy her time. The nurse seems to be encouraging Juliet to not feel trapped by her arranged marriage, seeming genuine in her care for Juliet as an individual rather than a pawn like her parents. The nurse here is similar to Benvolio, since she reminds Juliet of possible lovers outside of her parents' wishes, like Benvolio's reminder to a heartbroken Romeo that Rosalind is not the only girl in the world. If Juliet had a friend, she would have been able to avoid the regression towards more violent masculine tendencies. The play and critics portray women as more rational, especially through the comparison of Romeo and Juliet. So if Juliet had a young friend, it would likely have saved her life. Juliet was not close to anyone her own age other than Romeo, except arguably for her cousin Tybalt. But by the time he is murdered, Juliet already has experienced what French novelist Stendhal coined crystallization, which is defined as the process of focusing on the positive aspects of the love object and ignoring the negative. Without friends, Juliet is bound to justify any wrongdoing of Romeo, even if it is killing her cousin. However, a female friend would likely be able to rationalize with Juliet, grounding her and maintaining her feminine quality of emotional strength rather than aggression. Although Juliet would likely have been already attached to Romeo regardless of a friend, it is more likely that a female friend could have supported her with relief from Romeo's chaos and his tendency to strive towards it. In her relationship, Juliet gets overconsumed by Romeo and his masculine aggression, ultimately losing herself and her virtues in the process. Romeo's friends were like him, young men who are prone to aggression, so his friends are unable to help him. However, if Juliet had a friend, like her, sensible and rational, she would not act so reckless and be so dangerously attached to Romeo. Without heavy reliance on Romeo with friends, the relationship may have been successful and long-lasting if it did not progress so fast. Juliet ultimately suffers the consequences of her isolation and her death and loss of character. Here's another excerpt from my research paper. Juliet is unconsidered as a young girl without female friends, despite the importance of friends for Romeo since he is so dramatic. Even though Juliet has a very significant relationship with the nurse, as a worker for the Capulet family and a maternal figure for Juliet, their relationship is complicated. If Juliet had a meaningful relationship with someone her own age, she would likely maintain her high maturity throughout the play. As a young girl, despite her level-headedness, she must rely on friends for emotional support, like Romeo, and the failure to do so ultimately cost her life. Her regression towards chaos, like Romeo, also harms Romeo since Romeo relies on Juliet for safety and as an escape from the chaos of masculine responsibilities and stress of being a man in Verona. Even though women are seen as intelligent forces by many critics in my research, it is important to note that women are powerless in Verona at the time, except within the realms of their house or marriage where they may have a bit more voice. Even though Juliet's regression is due to her dependence on Romeo, he too craves peace from external stress in his partner. When Juliet is not able to maintain her rationality, Romeo is bound to spiral further into masculine chaos, disregarding the opportunity Juliet offers for comfort and peace. If Juliet had a like-minded rational companion, she could have maintained her rationality and her role as a relief from chaos for Romeo. In conclusion, even though the nurse is a crucial aspect of Juliet's life by fulfilling the maternal role, Juliet still is missing the necessary role of a companion. Especially as a young girl, it is inevitable that without friends, she will lose herself in a relationship. Since Romeo is portrayed as Juliet's closest friend and confidant, who is relatively close to her age, the deterioration of Juliet's character is understandable. An outsider in the relationship, a friend of Juliet, could have rationalized Juliet and refreshed her mind, detaching her from the unhealthy relationship with Romeo. After my research, I now think that in Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare shows the possibility of young love or codependent love and the tendency towards chaos. This intense love is temporary and unsustainable. Their love was never meant to last. It was meant to be eternalized through death, which reveals the impossibility of such an intense love. Overall, Shakespeare immortalizes their love in the piece while also revealing the destructive nature of their love. Thank you.
So our final speaker is Stacy Injimogu, whose paper is titled The Poetry of Wanda Coleman. She's a sophomore in nursing major, and she wrote this paper for Dr. Lentz's Poetry, Seduction, and Witchcraft class.
Wanda Coleman's poems showcase what it's like to be a Black woman in white America. Most of Coleman's poems have an underlying subject. There's a want to get her voice out there to spread awareness. Another topic of interest in her poems would be the language and how it is laid in between the lines. Shown in the first poem of the book, Wanda in Worry Land, she describes going after people with violence because they just won't listen to her Black voice. Towards the end, she finally realizes that going after people with violence won't get her anywhere, in which she says, "I have gone after people with poems." The whole poem supports 4 themes, the first being a curse. I have cursed out white lady cards pushers in supermarkets who block the aisles in slow motion. In many articles written about Wanda Coleman, a common argument would be about her writing style. Some say that it is revolutionary for its time, whilst others make it seem like her work was something foreign to what poetry should be. I believe the latter response is founded on 2 obvious reasons. The first being because she's a woman poet, and the second being that she's Black. In an article written by Terrence Howard about Coleman's work, it elaborates on the opinion of one of Terrence's mentors about Coleman and her work. It elaborates on the opinion, one of my mentors, a Black female poet of Wanda's generation, recently flatly said, "She was mean. She could be mean. It was a sharpness she honed over her years outside the care of poetry, collectives, coalitions, and institutions." The suggestion that Coleman was mean is unfounded. As Terrence clarifies, it wasn't that Coleman was mean. It was that her words were sharp and so were her actions. Considering that she is a minority pursuing a career in a field that doesn't really accept people of her kind, she had to be sharp, mean, or cutthroat. That fire in her most likely had to be the only way her writing would be dispersed amongst the masses. Without Coleman's sharpness, she wouldn't be known as the revolutionary poet we see her in today. American Sonnet 2 shows that same conversation being initiated in how women poets are blocked by undefeated odds. Coleman gives a beautiful imagery on how poets are beaten down by capitalist societies. She describes a comparison between writing without getting anywhere and working in a neon-lit hallway. Is sentenced to the eclipse of eternal corporate limbo, the exquisite isolation of endless neon-lit hallways. Capitalist corporate America puts it so that the vision of a poet is stifled to a fickle memory of what greatness should look like or sound like. There is a notion that Coleman feels that she's being choked by capitalism. To face the consequences of a devilish exploitation. There is a 2-edged sword that not only Coleman is pierced with, but many writers and poets are encountering. The analogy of the double-edged sword is built on these 2 options. Either she can continue to write and not let it go further because her writing isn't up to capitalist standards, or not write at all and live up to the expectations of the men that run away when a woman's voice is heard. The imagery of trying to see a sunset or a sensitive nightfall and having a building block your view is demonstrated in this poem. Coleman is the person trying to see the beautiful sunset, which is her writing, but being distributed to the masses and not shut down. Capitalist is the building. Not only are the buildings foundational, meaning they can't move, but they are the blockade that stumps the writer into either giving up or continuing to fight. That fight can become excruciatingly tired when there are exceedingly more buildings than there are sunsets. Following in the poem American Sonnet 61, Coleman writes about how she would use her voice to describe the relationship Black women have in a capitalist society run by men. The premise of the poem is to describe who she is in the eyes of white America. Coleman expresses that as a Black woman, she will use her African descent to describe the Black woman's struggle in her writing. This specific poem is an evolution of what the life of a Black poet appears. Something in common that all of the poems have is that a woman's voice will be the thing that terrifies men.
In her poem, When My Time Comes, she states, "When my time comes, I will speak to the night, it will rise and follow." Following the themes, there is another example of a stanza containing all four. There is a curse because her voice is a threat to men in capitalist societies, a charm because she is using her writing to influence other women to follow a path that will lead them to liberation even when she dies. An oath because Coleman makes it prudent that when her time comes she will do the following. And finally, an example of a command is not only is it an affirmation of what will come, but it also refers back to the title, meaning it will happen when she will deem it necessary. The last two poems I will reference are American Sonnet 85 and 91. There is a constant repetition of one word in the poem, jailer. Coleman calls out to her jailer multiple times and asks them questions. Some of the questions she asks form as derogatory, but the conditions she is alluding to are the derogatory form. Although the way she's asked her question come up as derogatory or sarcastic, there's a salvation aspect that appears from taking back oppressive language / action. Jailer, the cuffs between us, the cuffs so dear, what will you do when I'm no longer accessible by key? The moment she opens her mouth is when the jailer, like a woman at her fang, starts to retreat when she shows him her voice. They notice that she won't back down and stay quiet. Instead, she will challenge their knowledge of and how liberal or conservative they will be. There's a reference to the state of the world and how it feels like a prison. In an article by a Georgia Writers Association, it is quoted that Coleman says, "The image of society as a prison runs through my work, so it was on my mind and came spontaneously in 85. American Sonnet 85 is Coleman's reply to being held by chains of her oppressor. Towards the end of the poem, she says, "Jailer, why so quiet?" That is a stanza that supports my argument that she's taking back oppressive language / action. It seems like the roles became reversed. The man or jailer fell silent, and now the woman can speak without repercussions forced upon her. Lastly, the poem American Sonnet 91. The poem was not in the book Wicked Enchantments. While doing research, I found it quite interesting. This poem is surrounded by imagery that breaks down to one simple notion. The notion that to get anywhere in life, you need to be there first. In the first line of the stanza, it says, "The gates of mercy slapped on the right foot, they would not permit return and bent a wing." This poem is essentially about survival, and Coleman knows all about that. In the second sentence, it could be interpreted that people who are different aren't led into or allowed to return into that world, essentially saying that only the strong will survive and the weak are set aside. The world is a cruel place for those who are bent. There's an imagery of how the world isn't illustrated or even listened to through the voices of the weak or bent. The world is pictured as joyful and full of opportunity by the strong and cutthroat. Coleman is one of the strong. As previously mentioned, this poem wasn't in Wicked Enchantments, but it should have been. American Sonnet 91 is a perfect example of Wanda Coleman's work and how she planned on achieving what not to have. Coleman had a stigma that she would continuously curse at her work, but it wasn't cursing because she hated it. She would curse it because she is a Black woman who had to go the extra mile just to get her writings published. Coleman would work multiple jobs while trying to build her career as a poet, but also while being a single mom. From the outside, it looks like her life was a curse because of the hardship she had to go through to follow her dream. But one could argue that it was actually a charm, since charms are forms of protection. Wanda was protected from the downfall and evil that would come if she didn't continue to pursue her dream. These four themes are not only spread out amongst the book, but in each stanza of each poem. Wanda Coleman was an amazing poet that definitely removed the illusion of what the status quo was and still is. Thank you.
So thank you all, that's really fascinating. And Wanda Coleman obviously has to be on my mythic syllabus of 20th and 21st century sonnet writers. But we can talk about that outside of this. In any case, I have lots of questions, but this isn't just me, so does anyone want to get us started? I'm not going to get us started in an EB, but I'm sure you all have lots of questions too. Yes, Yanni?
This is a question for Jacqueline. So, based on the way that you interpret the Romeo and Juliet relationship, how do you think that's present today in society, with teens especially, and how do you think it's changed?
I think it's basically about today, you can see it in relationships that are just like what we would call toxic, like someone who isolates you from your friends and stuff. But Juliet doesn't have that from the start. She doesn't have friends. She's already isolated. So like I feel like that's more rare today. But she lived in like, there probably may not have been that many girls her age that she could have been friends with. But you know, today obviously you go to school, you're easy to have friends. But I think it changed in the sense where it would be more rare for someone to literally have no friends, but it would be more in the sense where you have friends, but then you're in a relationship where you're isolated.
Thank you. Dr. Burns? This question's for all three of you. I'm not sure exactly how to frame what I'm thinking. When I think about the women across representations, they're defined by relationship to other women, right? So think about the men that you researched in context of these different research projects you did. Are the men defined similarly in relationship to other, or are they defined independently by themselves? So can we define women independent, or are they always defined in relationship to another? Does that make sense?
Whoever wants to take a stab first at it. That's a violent metaphor, actually. Whoever wants, I was going to take a shot, but that's also violent.
It kind of plays hand in hand. See, for Vikings in general, for women, they could definitely be seen as, I wouldn't say totally independent, but they definitely had a source of a voice. They had, you know, they were capable of being included in legal disputes for typically for that time era, you wouldn't see a woman involved in any legal matters, anything that would be in like the financial department, like overseeing like the person house and any accounting house. So that portion, they could definitely be seen as, I guess, to your question, equal to man, but they're independent in their own sense, but man has their own independence. So for my portion, they're in their own levels of independence.
So for me and my research, Romeo was depicted as very weak, and he was talked about in reliance of his friends and Romeo by the critics. So Juliet was actually more portrayed as independent because she didn't have someone to really rely on in the same way. She had Romeo to rely on her, and she, you know, like I said in my paper, she used Romeo as an escape, but she didn't have anyone to kind of level her. That was her role for Romeo. So in my research, both Romeo and Juliet were kind of depicted as like needing someone to level them out.
For me, I think that women were seen as they needed somebody, but not just another woman who needed a man. But when you were saying about how would men be seen in the equal light, I wouldn't think so. I think men were seen as, if you want to be a poet, you can be a poet, it's fine, talk about whatever you want. But a woman, she's always like, oh, well, you shouldn't say that, that's not ladylike. So I think that's where Wanda Coleman is like, no, I don't want to be your ladylike, I want to be my own. And if I have to continue to be nasty about it, then I will, but I mean, that's just
Kelsey, I saw your hand earlier.
This is about Romeo and Juliet. How do you believe that Romeo's actions in the play would have changed? How do you feel like not being influenced by his friends?
Well, for my paper, it's more for Juliet being influenced by his friends. Romeo's friends were kind of useless to him because they're just like him, they're other men, so they can't help him. But my argument for Juliet having a friend other than it rationalizing her was also a friend could have told Romeo about her drinking the poison, so he wouldn't have thought that she was dead. Someone could have told Romeo about it, so he wouldn't have killed himself, and Juliet wouldn't have killed herself with it.
I'm just going to interject, obviously, I thought about Romeo and Juliet. I also wonder, the problem for Romeo is when he's separated. Like Benvolio is kind of a good influence on him. I agree the rest of them are useless. But, you know, like Mercutio just wants to party and whatnot. But he's separate, he's in exile, right? So that seems to be a big issue, right? He doesn't have the influence of the ones that are not useless. There was a hint in the back before.
This is for Wanda Coleman. So you mentioned that she was a black woman. How do you think her sexuality played into all of that as well? Because, you know, I was in a class with you actually, and we talked about that a lot, and I noticed it wasn't brought up. So I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
I think her sexuality was another thing that stifles her and her work, because she was seen as part of the LGBTQ community, but you don't really see it that much. You more see her skin color being part of her writing and how that's portrayed towards what her image, that's basically her image. But I feel like if she did write more about her feelings about that, there would have been more outreach for it, but because you have to think about the time too, it's not really accepted like how it would be now. So that's another thing that would put her way back than just her skin color.
What's the time frame? Just out of Okay, yeah, right. I have to read this one. I mostly know about her from Terrence Hayes' American Sonnet, the one that's dedicated to honesty, yeah.
A question for Amber and Stacy. Did you hear any, resonance with each other's essays? So, The Woman Warrior is Wanda Coleman. Did that kind of resonate with you? Stacy, when you heard Amber and Amber, did you hear anything in the way Stacy talked about Wanda Coleman as this kind of, female poet who was really assertive that kind of made you think about your own writing? So how did you hear each other's essays?
I remember reading this poet in class about how her kid drew a dragon, and it was kind of like, where did you get that from? Like, where did you get this fire from? Which I can relate to the Viking thing, because it's like dragons are seen as this big, scary thing, but really they're just there to protect, and I get that's what you're coming from with the Viking, how women are there to protect, and by any means possible.
To further branch off of that, after the LGBTQI comment, I could definitely see how the third gender theory that I mentioned really plays a role into her essay as well, because you have these 70s to 90s in this time frame. You can also see masculine and feminine attributes within Wanda herself, being she doesn't want to have those feminine characteristics. She wants to have this voice that typically men would have in society, whereas for my third gender theory, it would be the same thing. They didn't want to only be just a wife, just a housewife, basically. They wanted to be more than that, and they would pick up the arms, they would pick up the training, they would be on the battlefield. So I could see how the theory that I mentioned in my paper would reflect on her.
Other questions? Yeah, Jessica.
I have a question for Amber. First of all, excellent presentation. Your topic is super interesting. And specifically, just the idea of women being so intertwined in this society is really rare. They were really a part of, the larger picture of what was going on. Whereas later on, pre-modern societies, they're not really a part of anything. You mentioned fears of independence, and I think that's common in any society. But I think what makes it unique in the Viking society is that the spheres merged a little bit, greatly actually, in their cultural warfare. And I'm just wondering why do you think later on in pre-modern societies it was so different? Do you think it was because the Viking culture was lost? Do you think it was influenced by religion? And also, do you think that there's anything we can learn from the Viking culture as people today?
So it was definitely influenced by religion, because at this time they had their own set of religions. They looked at the gods and goddesses, and then as they started raiding more and more, they began to see Christianity more and more. Eventually, it led to their downfall. Christianity seeped more and more in. There was a Viking
But he took the first step that brought Christianity in total to the Viking culture in a whole. He was the first to get baptized, and he like led the reins from that point forward. It was definitely influenced by religion. And what can we learn from it? Women are capable of doing tasks that are not completely all men, but some men see women as inferior. Women are just as capable of doing anything that men do. I feel like I propose that quite frequently for a few years.
I think something else that you mentioned that was at least it out to me, they still play domestic roles. And these roles themselves are glorified. Whereas in humanist studies and even today, domestic roles are kind of seen as inferior. They're really not. So I think that Viking women really presented that well. That domestic roles are more dominant roles that are both important.
Totally 100% agree with that, without a doubt. I think Valkyries and how you would only assume Valkyries were on the battlefield with the soldiers, determining who goes up to Valhalla, who doesn't go up. But then once they're in Valhalla, they're actually serving like whoever is there. So they're not just these warriors, they're also partaking in these like housewife duties, these like privacy or responsibilities. So it's emerged and mentioned.
Other questions? Okay, how are we doing? All right, I'm gonna ask my question. So one thing that really struck me, starting with Amber, your presentation, but then because I was thinking about this throughout, was how literature is, because you were talking about how they are in society and then in literature, and it seems like in literature they have even more power than they might. I mean, they have some in society, but literature really glorifies them. And so I was thinking about literature, poetry, plays as a way to kind of navigate or resist some of the restrictions that society presents. And so I wondered if you each could speak about if that seems right, if that you see that reflected in the literature that you're thinking of writing about.
There's one, it's the poetic, I can never pronounce it, but that was the main source where it was a lot of females that I believe glorified as a goddess, because you had Freya, and there was one of the main goddesses that we looked up to, and then you had the Valkyries of Gilbert, who was, one of the Valkyries that they looked up to. She was the main goddess she was the main that I'd see consistently over and over again. And when there was female accounts from like society and outside of literature, they themselves would compare themselves to the ruler. So they definitely had, I would say overlap. They definitely had this, I want to say just further more influences, like from society to them. But there was this clear distinction that I've noticed in the readings between Anglo-Saxon chronicles and between the literature and the sagas and tales where there was this clear distinction of the women knew they weren't gods themselves, but they knew that they held a great amount of power. And there was an article that I read that went into depth about how they had the capability of divorce. If they were unhappy in marriage, they were capable of leaving, they were capable of having their dowry back, they could hold land, they could even have custody of their children. They had that power that you see today in women. And that was like, I would say so, I guess the legal aspect of their laws, order, everything, justice, that was their power, not only the battle.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting.
For me, I think it wasn't really like a specific poem, but it was like generally the whole book itself. And I mean, going back to when she was talking about power, I think Wanda's words, even though like I said, like they were cutthroat, they were mean, and all of that, but it needed to be in order for like things to get out there, because if it's not getting by in a nice way, then it's like, you guys need to hear this. I'm putting it this way, and I mean, it got a lot of traction.
And she's writing sonnets too, right? Like which are the property of white men,
right? Which makes it like even better, because it's like, oh, why are like the question of why are you doing that? But it's like I can't, right?
I'm gonna take your form and use this myself.
sense. In my research, all the critics basically like chose Juliet as the one that was rational and idealized her, and Romeo represented like regression and was responsible for her regression. So it made women in the play and Juliet specifically just look good and all. None of my research was saying anything was Juliet's fault. It was basically all saying everything was Romeo's fault.
No, and I think the play is doing so much Juliet being like strong and expressing her desires, and Romeo's like a parody of some patriarchal lover, right? Other questions? So let's thank this really awesome panel.
So thank you so much, Dr. Gaydos. And just a couple of things to say before we leave. First, I want to thank our faculty. The work they do with these students is extraordinary. We're very lucky in humanities. Have great colleagues. Dr. Gaydos, Dr. Schmicker, and all the people who advise you and work with you. We're very glad we have them here. But more important than that, we really want to take just a second to thank the students and humanities, because faculty are great. We like them, but our students are part of the reason we get to do this every year. We get to have so much fun. So thank you all so much for representing such wonderful students in our district. And other than that, let's have coffee, because all the paid for, we may as well take it. Same with the cookies. Thank you all so much.